Hey everyone. So last class we talked about Watergate and the downfall of Nixon's presidency. In this lecture, I'm going to start by talking about some of the successes Nixon had in foreign policy and in reaching a period of détente in the Cold War, because that was a huge success of his presidency, even though he had plenty of scandal and his presidency certainly did not end well. So let's start by talking about his Cold War successes. So Nixon, and we've mentioned this before, he tried to play China and the USSR, the Soviet Union, off against one another, hoping to bring an end to what was going on in Vietnam. So Nixon wants to get us out of Vietnam. It hasn't been going well, and he's hoping that if he can play the Soviet Union and the Chinese governments against each other, or establish relationships with both in the US, that will help us in Vietnam. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's foreign policy advisor, we've talked about him before as well. He still advises a lot of presidents today. He had this idea, and he had already been meeting secretly with the Vietnamese to try to end the war, and he presents this idea to Nixon. So Nixon starts out by visiting China in February of 1972. And this was huge. It's the first time a US president had visited China, communist China. He is there. He works out a deal with Chairman Mao, the leader of China, to normalize their relationship, normalize relations between the US and China. In other words, our governments will start communicating with each other again. Part of the deal was that the US had to accept what's called the One China policy, which basically means that Taiwan is part of China. Remember when Mao had come in and overthrown Chiang Kai-shek, he had fled to Taiwan. Taiwan doesn't necessarily consider itself part of China. Officially, though, the US does. And that is because we want to have a relationship with China. And that comes from this meeting. And you'll still hear about that policy, the One China policy, sometimes in the news today. I remember hearing about it when President Trump was elected. We weren't sure what the official administration policy was going to be toward China today. So we recognize One China. We have reduced commitment to Taiwan in favor of relationship with the Chinese. Also, in 1972, a few months later, in May of 1972, Nixon travels to Moscow to meet with the Soviet Union. The Soviets are hungry. They need food from us, but they're not happy about our growing relationship with China. And so Nixon meets with the Soviet leader, Brezhnev, and out of their meeting becomes an era of détente, which means relaxed tension. The Cold War is not going to be so dangerous for a while. We're going to kind of let things go. We're going to try to get along. Um, From that period of détente, we also get a 3-year deal. We would sell food to the Soviets, and in return, we got an anti-ballistic missile treaty. This would limit each to 2 clusters, the Soviets and the US. We could each have 2 clusters of defensive missiles, and there were arms reduction negotiations called SALT, and that was aimed at freezing the number of long-range missiles that the 2 countries had. You still hear about missile reduction between Russia and the US today. This is not something that's gone away even today, and this is from 1972. So we're talking over 40 years ago, and we're still hearing things about both of these issues today. Also in 1972, Nixon is reelected. We talked last class about how he had people working to in the committee to reelect the president creep. They are breaking into the Watergate complex, trying to get secrets from the DNC, but It wasn't really necessary because Nixon wins overwhelmingly. He defeated the senator from South Dakota, George McGovern, who won only one state. McGovern only won Massachusetts. Nixon won all other 49 states. He did lose one electoral vote in Virginia to a third party candidate because that elector didn't go along with the rest of the state. But Nixon overwhelmingly wins the 1972 election. He won't be in office for very long, though. He'll only be president for another year and a half or so. So there is success in foreign policy. The Cold War is at a period of détente. Things are getting better that way. Things are not getting better, though, economically. The country enters into a period of economic malaise, and this is going to last throughout the 1970s. After 2 decades of economic and industrial growth, the 70s are going to see a sharp decline in productivity and in income. Which is really an economic condition that shouldn't be there. Okay, you should either have the economy getting better or things happening to get the economy worse. But this becomes known as stagflation because the economy is stagnant. It's not changing. In theory, you shouldn't be able to have unemployment and inflation going up at the same time, but that is exactly what happened. And let's talk about why. There are four main causes for stagflation. The first is a declining investment in new machinery. So you're not finding new ways to make products and make them more efficient. The second cause, the government has imposed new safety and health regulations, which are expensive for companies to enact, and that makes prices go up. Vietnam is draining government money, and the money needs to be going into education to help people with these new regulations, to develop new ideas and new machines. But what's happening is that the brightest minds in the country are being put in the military and sent to Vietnam instead of going into the private sector and into business. And the fourth is inflation. Welfare, which we have the new system of Medicaid and welfare under the Great Society of Johnson, which did help with poverty, but at the same time, they cause inflation because they give people more money, which means prices are going to go up because there is not a new supply of goods. There's the same number of supply stays the same, demand is increasing, and so prices are going to go up. So you have inflationary there. So there's four main causes, but regardless of those causes, the cost of living is going to triple from 1969 to 1980. So in the 70s, the cost of living triples. That is a lot. That is huge. Businesses are not modernizing. They don't really have a reason to. The economy's not good, so why would they try to make things better? European and Asian countries that had been no threat in the 50s and 60s. And so we didn't need to advance our technology. What we had was fine. Nobody is doing anything better. And so we don't need to we aren't challenged to make things better. President Ford takes over for Nixon after Nixon resigns in 1974, and he launches an unsuccessful attempt to solve the situation with a program called WIN, which stands for Whip Inflation Now. It asked Americans to voluntarily control spending, wage demands, and price increases. It did not work. When Ford is not elected in 1976, we have Jimmy Carter becoming president. So he's elected in 1976, and he tries tax and spending cuts. Those fail, doesn't work. Inflation and unemployment continue to be on the rise. So he responds by delivering what is called his Malaise speech. He basically chided Americans for falling into a moral and spiritual crisis and for being too militaristic. The picture that just came up on the right is from another speech that he gave not very long after he became president, just a couple weeks into his presidency at the beginning of 1977. He wore this sweater in a speech about energy because we're starting to get into an energy crisis, which we'll talk about next. He also gives what a lot of people say is completely politically tone deaf speech. So you're going to watch a little clip from it right now, and then we'll talk about it in a minute. Okay, that did not work. We'll watch that clip in class next time and talk about it then. But regardless, he's basically telling Americans that they're not being moral enough and they're not, doing all that they need to do to make the economy better. That does not go over well. Americans are struggling. The economy is terrible. Things are expensive. And telling Americans that they need to do more is just not helpful. Ideas like this help Carter to be a one-term president. A lot of people think he was a horrible president, and that it just tone deaf to what's going on in America at this time. Another thing that happens is an energy crisis, sparked because of the formation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which we've talked about before. But it basically had allowed the Middle East to control the price of oil but throughout the war. The U.S. is allied with Israel. We had taken the side of Israel in a series of Arab-Israeli conflicts. So OPEC announced an embargo on oil shipments to the U.S. OPEC also cuts its worldwide production because of that, and we don't have enough gas. And so lines start growing at U.S. gas stations. There is a gas shortage crisis in the U.S. An economic recession is going to hit because of this. So, and it's not just going to hit the U.S., it's also going to hit Britain and France and Europe as well. So to combat this, Congress passes a series of solutions, okay? And you can see pictures of these solutions down at the bottom. We'll talk about them as I go. So the national speed limit had been 70 miles per hour. Congress reduces the national speed limit to 55 miles an hour, which is supposed to be an ideal speed for gas conservation. So you can see workers changing the speed limit from 70 to 55. It's back up to 70 now, but at the time it had gone down because of the energy crisis. Fuel efficient cars are being introduced from Europe and Asia. Here you see a VW Bug, Volkswagen being a German company, or not German, anyway, a European company, and the US big three, Chrysler, GMC, and Ford are going to be hurt because of these fuel efficient cars coming out of Europe. The U.S. is going to begin construction of the Alaska oil pipeline, which is this picture on the left. And we're going to start looking to expand our solar and nuclear energy efficient energy sources. There are limits to how much gas you can get because of the gas shortages. So these are the solutions that the U.S. put in place. They did and did not work. Thankfully, OPEC finally ends the embargo in 1974, but they quadrupled the price of oil. So even though there's more gas, it's way more expensive. And this just adds to inflation and adds to the energy crisis that's facing the U.S. So you need to make sure you've taken notes. If you need to go back and watch something, do that. We will have a quiz next class. I will see you then.